Remains by Simon Armitage. Remains is a poem by Simon Armitage told anecdotally through the eyes of a soldier suffering from post-traumatic stress. Through his eyes, we see that he suffered a terrible incident during the war, where he's not sure whether or not he killed someone accidentally or whether or not it was justified. Through the language, we see that this is not the only traumatic memory playing on his mind, and we see how he soon turns to drinks and drugs to try and block out the memory. However, this is unsuccessful, and he soon has a nervous breakdown. Remains by Simon Armitage is made up of 8 stanzas of mostly unrhymed quatrains, apart from the last 2 lines at the end, which stand alone. The disintegration of the poem's structure could reflect the disintegration of the speaker's mind, due to what's happened to him, but also due to what's going on now that he's back at home. He's turned to drink and drugs and is unable to recover from the incident. The poem is largely unrhymed to mimic natural speech and the fast pace of a monologue. The first half of the poem covers what happened during the incident and all the gory details. The second half covers how he's attempting to recover from this and how he's trying to cope. We know that he is unsuccessful due to the structure of the poem and how it appears on the page, as well as what we discover through listening to him. The title of the poem, Remains, could refer to what remains of the speaker's mental state following the traumatic incident which happened to him during the war. It could also refer to the remains of the body itself, which we find out about in the first half of the poem. As the poem is an anecdotal monologue, it is fast-paced and uses colloquialisms such as mate and legged it. This allows us to get into the mind of the poet and the speaker and to follow his journey alongside him, as if we were seeing it from his own perspective. The poem shifts from the past into the present, and we find out, due to repetition of words such as again and again, that this is not the first time he has remembered this incident, nor could it be the only incident which he has to remember. We see how it plays on his mind through this use of repetition. The themes in the poem Remains covers guilt, life, and conflict. The phrase probably armed, probably not is repeated throughout the poem, emphasizing the poet's sense of guilt over whether or not he did the right thing. By talking about a distant, sun-drenched land, the poet is emphasizing the fact that he was part of a war and an army, introducing the idea of responsibility and whether or not he can be held accountable, even by himself, for following orders. Porphyria's Lover by Robert Browning is a dramatic monologue. It's written from the perspective of the speaker who loves and murders a young woman called Porphyria. It is set in a cottage during a winter's night. Porphyria comes in from the storm and begins to make the cottage homely and cheery. Upon seeing her, our speaker is struck by the beauty of the moment and realizes that Porphyria may soon give in to societal pressures to leave him. We know this because, as his lover, she is visiting him outside of wedlock. She also bares her shoulders, which was considered very risque at the time. In order to capture the beauty of the moment, Porphyria's lover wraps her hair around her neck and strangles her. He does this slowly and describes the moment in great detail. Afterwards, he toys with the corpse by propping it up next to him and opening its eyes. From the outside, the scene looks entirely wholesome and innocent, as a man sits with his lover inside a cheery cottage enjoying the winter's evening. Porphyria's Lover by Robert Browning is a dramatic monologue where the thoughts of the poet are separated from the thoughts of the speaker. Much like many of Browning's other work, he begins the poem after the main event, and the speaker is not allowed to address us until after he has killed Porphyria. The structure itself is rigid in nature, other than a small asymmetry of A, B, A, B, B. This could mimic the hidden madness which the speaker conceals in his mental state. As well as this, it follows concrete poetry in form, where on the page it appears as if the flowing locks of Porphyria are flowing down the page itself. In Porphyria's Lover, one of the main images is of Porphyria's hair. When she enters the cottage, she is described as allowing her damp hair to fall. By using the word fall, Browning could be suggesting that she has fallen as a woman in society. By entering the cottage out of wedlock, she has lowered herself into sin. This is juxtaposed when he describes her hair as being yellow blonde. This was often used to describe the angelic purity and nature of women who have not sinned. He also uses diminutives to describe Porphyria later on after her murder. For example, Porphyria's lover strangles her little neck. This shows her as being less powerful and physically inferior to him. This, coupled with the rigid rhyme scheme, gives the poem a robotic nature, thus shocking the reader even more, as we are surprised when he finally kills Porphyria by strangling her. This also shows that his madness is ingrained and he does not see anything wrong with what he has done. Mother Any Distance by Simon Armitage is a poem which focuses on the mundane moments of everyday life. We see the speaker, presumably moving house, at one end of a measuring tape and his mother at the other. As he pulls away, we learn about his apprehension in moving on and becoming independent. However, we also hear the message that she will always be there for him to help him, should he need her. Mother Any Distance by Simon Armitage is a brief 15-line poem split over 3 stanzas. As it is not a sonnet, we are forced to reflect over the extra line. We are also forced to reflect on the nature of love in this poem. It is not a traditional romantic sonnet of romantic love, but actually a relationship between a mother and a son. As the son begins to move away from his mother physically, and the spool of tape unravels between them, he actually remains tethered to her at all times, and the connection is never broken. This could reflect the safety he feels in moving away from her and still remaining connected. The tape itself could be a metaphor for the umbilical cord. That in itself could also represent the connection between them and the strength of this bond. As he moves further and further away and approaches the hatch to freedom and the sky, he realizes that he needs to decide whether or not he will fall or fly. This is posed as a rhetorical question, reflecting his uncertainty in his own independence. He will need to decide whether or not he is able to cope without his mother, and also reflects on the relationship between them so far. In Mother Any Distance, the language can focus on the natural world. For example, acres and prairies. This could reflect the instinctive and close relationship between the speaker and his mother. Language such as single span focuses on the distance, and in particular, how minuscule this distance could be. This could reflect the speaker's lack of confidence in himself, even when he's separated from his mother by such a small distance. Going out into the outside world, anchor and kite, these 2 words are juxtaposed with each other. Anchor shows that his mother is what keeps him grounded and holds him down, but this could also be negative. Perhaps he feels too weighed down by his mother. Kite suggests that he wishes to fly. However, a kite is still tethered to the ground, and this could be reflecting back to the cord between them. Winter Swans by Owen Shears describes a couple who are taking a walk by a lake in winter. As they are walking, we can see that it has recently been raining and that they are slightly apart, so perhaps this reflects a recent argument between the 2 of them. A pair of swans appear on the lake, and they are shown to be righting themselves, as if after a storm. One of the couple remarks that birds mate for life, so it becomes apparent that this is a poem about their relationship and what has occurred between them. We are to believe that the couple are able to reconcile their differences, and as they leave the lake, they are slightly closer and holding hands. Winter Swans by Owen Shears is made up of 7 stanzas. The first 6 stanzas are 3 lines long. The final stanza is only 2 lines long. This reflects the reconciliation of the couple by the end of the poem. The rhythm of the poem is disjointed, much like their relationship. Stanza 3 begins with the word until, and this brings a shift in their relationship along with the arrival of the swans. The use of enjambment throughout the poem reflects the flowing nature of the swans and their journey across the lake. It could also reflect the journey of the couple throughout life, as we are led to believe that they have been together for a long time and that their relationship is able to weather just another storm. The language in Winter Swans by Owen Shears is very straightforward and effective. It works on both a literal and metaphorical level. There are many references to pairs, such as 2 days, one over the other, and a pair of wings. This reflects the union of the couple, their closeness, and their connection. The references to rain and the waterlogged mud could reflect the conflict between them, but more specifically, the differences and difficulties in their communication. However, by the end, they closed the distance between them, and this is shown to be an end to the conflict between them as well. As they walk away, the pair of swans are also able to right their way up and sail off gracefully, whereas during their arrival, they were slightly more rocky and unable to glide gracefully. Before You Were Mine by Carol Ann Duffy is a poem where the poet herself is looking at a photograph of her mother back when she was young. They are discussing what it was like back then, and she's thinking back and cannot quite believe that her mother was once as young and glamorous as she appears. This sets a very nostalgic tone to the poem and forces us to consider the relationship between both mother and daughter. The poet is wondering whether or not her mother changed or lost anything when she was born. Before You Were Mine by Carol Ann Duffy is 4 stanzas long, and each stanza is made up of 5 lines. There is the use of enjambment throughout, and no discernible rhythm or structure. This adds to the conversational tone, which makes us seem as if we're part of the conversation between Duffy and her mother. She speaks directly to her mother, which emphasizes the relationship between them, and we are forced to consider the journey they have come on. As she looks back into the past, each stanza becomes a snapshot of a memory, and she considers how her mother back then has become her mother now. The language in Before You Were Mine by Carol Ann Duffy switches between the present and the past. It also focuses on imagery related to her mother. For example, she's building up to her own arrival, using language such as, "I'm 10 years away," "I'm not here yet." This reinforces the idea that we are moving through a series of snapshots and going on a journey with Duffy as she looks back on her mother's life. She also juxtaposes the life her mother used to live with how life must have been after. At the time, in the 1950s, women with children would not have been expected to have gone out and gone dancing with their friends. They would have had to stay home and look after their children. So the fizzy movie tomorrows and the red high-heeled dancing shoes are now described as relics. This suggests that they are now ancient, forgotten, and no longer needed. There is almost a sense of guilt as Duffy wonders whether or not her mother would have been happy with these changes and how her life would have been affected by the arrival of Duffy. The Farmer's Bride by Charlotte Mew is the tragic so-called love story between a farmer and his wife. The farmer's wife had been married off to him and put on the farm against her will. The farmer assumed that they could have a normal relationship right away, and even a conventional relationship. However, she has been refusing his advances ever since and chooses instead to lock herself in her room and play on the farm with the animals. The farmer becomes more and more frustrated, and we begin to see his anger mount. In The Farmer's Bride by Charlotte Mew, she uses a mix of rhyming couplets and alternate rhyme. She also rhymes 3 or 4 lines together sometimes. This creates quite a disjointed effect, which she's able to use to great effect with stanza breaks, punctuation, and enjambment. By running lines together, this reflects the content of the poem, where the farmer's bride is often running away from him. We also see his confusion mounting, and Muse has a technique where she often leaves a line unfinished to give you one idea, only to complete it later with a completely different idea. For example, the farmer describes his wife as being happy to chat and play, so we think she must be recovered from her trauma of being married off to the farmer and forced to live on the farm. However, Mew later finishes the line with, happy to chat and play with rabbits and birds, and we could see that actually she's not happy to be there at all and could be descending into a madness instead. The language in Farmer's Bride by Charlotte Mew focuses on animal imagery, in particular, the speech of the farmer himself. By focusing on the animal imagery for his own speech, it shows us that perhaps he is not accustomed to human company, and this explains why he is so confused by his wife's reaction to having been chosen as his wife and forced to live on his farm. He uses language such as, I chose her for a maid. This kind of language reinforces the sense of patriarchy imposed upon her and shows that she was merely a possession to be owned and told what to do, with no free will of her own or any choice in the matter. Climbing My Grandfather by Andrew Waterhouse is an autobiographical poem. It's also an open letter of admiration to his grandfather. He remembers a time when he was small, looking up at his grandfather and thinking of him as a giant. In the poem, he likens him to a mountain to be climbed, and he does this affectionately, seeing him as something more powerful and stronger than himself. Literally, he's climbing onto his grandfather's lap, and it is a fond memory with a nostalgic undertone. Climbing My Grandfather is written in present tense and the first person, which makes it conversational in tone and narrative verse. Even though it is written in the present tense, we still very much get a sense of looking back into the past and remembering a fond memory as if we were there with the speaker. There are no discernible structural features such as repetition or stanza breaks. This could reflect the mountain itself, something to be climbed or something to be overcome. As the grandfather is described as a kindly old man, we do not receive the sense that this is threatening or imposing in any way, but rather a challenge and a sense of achievement. Climbing My Grandfather is in itself an extended metaphor, but there are also individual metaphors throughout the poem. For example, a grandfather's scar is described as a glassy ridge. These are intimate details which could only be known by the poet himself, which reinforces the strength of the relationship between them, but also the fondness the poet holds for his grandfather. We also have the paradox of his skin being described as warm ice, which reinforces the idea that this is merely a memory from a long-forgotten past, and how difficult it is to put feelings and senses into words. Walking Away by Cecil Day Lewis examines the relationship between a father and son. It is set during a football match when a little boy hurts himself and does not run to his father. At the end of the game, he also walks away, not needing his father's comfort or celebration. The speaker is perplexed by this and has to examine his own feelings, which are mixed. On one hand, he's upset that he is no longer needed. On the other hand, he is proud of his child's independence and the fact that he is growing up. Walking Away by Cecil Day Lewis is slow and measured in pace. This could reflect the gradual thought process by both the boy and his father as he grows up and starts to become more independent. It could also reflect how they feel about this in a slow and measured thought process. It is often monosyllabic in tone, with words rhymed such as day, play, and away. This adds a melancholic tone and also shows that these feelings are uncomplicated and raw. They are not overly thought out at this point. The poem is 4 stanzas in length, each stanza being 5 lines long. In Walking Away by Cecil Day-Lewis, the poet uses a simile to reflect the moment of separation. For example, like a satellite then pulled away into orbit. The poet uses enjambment to separate this line, reflecting the separation felt by the father as he feels his son is being tugged away by force. A satellite is also a smaller, less important object kept in orbit by a larger object with its own gravity. This could reflect the importance of the father in the son's life, but also, literally, his size. The father could be seen as an imposing figure in the boy's life, or as a tethering one, keeping him anchored to protection and safety.